Chag Sameach. Shalom. I'm Rabbi Rudin Luria from Jeshurun congregation, and I want to truly thank you for learning with me at Jeshurun's Tikkun at Home series. Thank you to our co-sponsors for your support as well. I hope that you're all safe and healthy. In this session, we will explore the David rules, life lessons from King David and the modern state of Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. The festival of Shavuot is intimately tied into the life and the legacy of the Davids. Our Bible's King David was born and died on Shavuot, the 6th day of Sivan, the day when we celebrate the anniversary of the revelation at Mount Sinai. This is both King David's birthday and Yortzeit, and is on this day that we read the book of Ruth, the biblical scroll which tells of the chesed, the kindness, the loyalty, the dedication, the faith, and the sacrifice of King David's great-grandmother, Ruth, who marries Boaz. The final word of the biblical book of Ruth is David. His name and his legacy resonate so strongly on this holiday. As for our modern-day David, Shavuot originally had an agricultural focus, focusing and following the harvest season in Eretz Yisrael. It is the first fruit Bikurim festival when in ancient times we approached the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, gifting our produce. With the establishment of the modern state, perhaps our dairy meals of blintzes and cheesecake, reminiscent of the land flowing with milk and honey, Eretz Avat Chalav Udavash, only strengthen our connection with Israel, thanks in large part to David Ben-Gurion. Perhaps you're thinking, why group together King David and David Ben-Gurion? How could you compare their lives? First off, they lived 3,000 years apart. Second off, King David was a mighty warrior, vibrant, youthful, strong, and chiseled. And Ben-Gurion, well, he's got an airport named after him. He wasn't exactly physically strong or chiseled. He's got the hair of Albert Einstein. He was short, always looked old even when he was young. Third, one was chosen by divine prophecy. God directing the prophet Shmuel Samuel to anoint David as king, starting the Davidic Monarchy, the royal line in the house of Judah, which continues to the Messianic line. Whereas our modern-day David formed a political party in pre-state Palestine and was democratically elected prime minister of Israel. I hope you'll agree that these two Davids are much more similar than they are different. Let's take a look and see what you think. We're first going to take a look at our first slide. On the left, you see Marc Chagall's painting depicting David as not as warrior, but as a musician and as a poet. With harp or lyre in hand, he is animated, colorful. To me, this painting evokes joy. And on the right, a classic shot of Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. Not so colorful, this black and white photo evokes elder statesmen. In the recently published Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leader Shaped Its Destiny by Dennis Ross and David Makovsky, this is their opening description of him. Quote, David Ben-Gurion was square-jawed, 5'4". His prematurely white hair conferred an aura of biblical eccentricity. By middle age, as he grew stouter, he would become to be known as the Old Man. Israel's foremost novelist, Amos Oz, called him a walking exclamation mark, projecting awesome willpower and a volcanic temper. The founding father of the state of Israel, Ben-Gurion never deviated from his goal of establishing a state for the Jewish people in their historic homeland. His unwavering goal was Jewish sovereignty. Against all odds, the ancient state was reborn. He embraced with singular focus connecting people with the land, a strategy based on Jewish immigration, enlisting a major power to back Zionism and its push for mass migration to Palestine. He was in truth a realist, seeking achievable goals. Informing his realism was a deep knowledge of geopolitics, based on voluminous reading. He foresaw the existential peril faced by the Jews of Europe and how Zionism offered a solution. He was willing to sacrifice for his cause, but believed that force alone couldn't reach the objective. Neither could pure reason and argument. Let's take a look at another slide. Here you'll see the most classic statues of our two Davids. On the left is Michelangelo's David, considered one of the greatest pieces of art ever made, a masterpiece, the strength, the youth, the power, the closest thing there could be to perfection. And on the right, that statue of David Ben-Gurion doing his famous calisthenics, his headstands on the beach in Tel Aviv. Not exactly the chiseled David. He was not ashamed, though. He was real. Also, he was willing to look at the world upside down from different angles. Let's take a look at one more comparison in art. Here you see the bronze David, the one with hair and the one without hair. The young hero with sword in hand, Donatello's masterpiece, and then Ben-Gurion's wrinkled brow, his hardened face. To reiterate, art history aside, I propose that there is more that unites these two Davids, perhaps the greatest Davids in Jewish history, than differentiates them. They both share a love of the land of Israel and the Jewish people, and their leadership in challenging times each set the course for Israel's history and independent sovereignty after them. They were both brilliant strategists, single-minded leaders, unrelenting in the pursuit of their goals. They were both realists and idealists, visionaries that could see new possibilities when no one else could. They were also pragmatists that united for the common good. Let's begin by looking at the origin stories of our Davids, both coming from modest and humble beginnings, the lowest of the low. This is going to be our chart. We're going to look at these origin stories and see how both King David and David Ben-Gurion perhaps had similar trajectories in their path to leadership. In the Bible, there are 3 different origin stories for King David. We first meet the warrior poet, hero, and king as a young boy, a shepherd, the youngest in his family, almost forgotten. The prophet Samuel is directed to meet the once and future king who is identified as the son of Jesse. Upon Samuel's request, Jesse's sons are brought out. The 7 oldest sons are presented before him, while the youngest, David, is out with the sheep. Here he is not even considered in the running. He is tending the sheep, a motif for leadership, and yet we know what awaits him. The next origin story begins with Saul. The first king of Israel is paranoid and timid, frightened, anxiety-ridden, a man who needs the musical talents of David to calm him and help him sleep. Saul's attendant suggests David to come and help Saul, saying with these words from our Tanakh, "I know of a young man skilled in playing calm music. He is a valiant fellow, a warrior, prudent in speech, a good-looking man. The Lord is with him." With that formidable resume and that LinkedIn profile, the ideal virtues, Saul is convinced and sends for David. David would take up the lyre and Saul would find relief. Here David is a caregiver, a provider, a calming force, an artist, a music therapist, and an aid to the king. The third and last origin story, of course, is that of David and Goliath, one of the most well-known in the entire Tanakh. It can be understood as a model for the age-old experience of the Jewish people, the miraculous survival, the victory of the weak over the mighty, the few over the many, the underdog, miraculously overcoming impossible odds, the repeated themes of our holidays of Hanukkah, Purim, and the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948, as declared by our other David, David Ben-Gurion. As Rabbi David Wolpe writes in his book, David, the Divided Heart, in the biblical story, we meet a young David who's idealistic and unafraid. He felt the national and theological affront by the Philistine giant Goliath, and David is certain that he can do the impossible, that he will win. Different than Moses, Jonah, Jeremiah, and so many other Jewish leaders who express uncertainty, fear, and inability to lead the people, our biblical David is determined, ready, confident, stunningly self-assured, not unlike David Ben-Gurion. He was daring and could be volatile at times. David is the symbol of resistance, of overcoming formidable odds, the few victorious over the many, the young over the old, small nation over the larger. But there's more. David has vision and imagination. He can enlarge perspectives, problem solve, quickly pivot, adjust, and change trajectory. The same with our David Ben-Gurion. When it is clear that Goliath cannot be filled with armor and sword, for King Saul gives his own armor and sword to David to use in the fight, he takes them off. David envisions another possibility. When King Saul pursues David throughout the country later, David flees to join the enemy camp. When Jerusalem is just a backwater town, he sees it as a capital. When worship is nomadic in a traveling tent in the Mishkan, David envisions a temple. When we call someone resourceful, Rabbi Wolpe writes, we credit the person with drawing from what is there in useful ways. But David is beyond resourceful. He creates anew, like our David Ben-Gurion. And what of the origin stories of David Ben-Gurion? If we look back at the slide, we can see that he also has more than one origin story. This David is perhaps a Goliath, born in Planks, which at times was part of Poland and other times part of Russia. David Ben-Gurion was not born David Ben-Gurion. He was born with the name David Green. He came from nothing, but yet he continually learned, he grew, he rose up against the tide from his modest beginnings, and here is his origin story as told by himself in his memoirs. For David Ben-Gurion was a diarist. He wrote and wrote and wrote. Quote, I can hardly remember a time when the idea of building what we used to call Eretz Yisrael wasn't the guiding factor in my life. It is not an exaggeration to say that at the age of 3, I had daydreams of coming to Palestine. At 3, my grandfather began teaching me Hebrew. He would sit me on his knee, and I would repeat the words after him. Within months, I became fluent in Hebrew. Listening to my grandfather tell stories of Jewish history, I clearly recall thinking to myself, Plansk isn't my real home. I must go to the land of Israel. When I was just a little older, Theodor Herzl came to our small city. When he appeared in Planks, people greeted him as the Messiah. We children were much impressed. It was easy for a small boy to see in Herzl the Messiah. He was tall, finely featured. One glimpse of him and I was ready to follow him, and there to the land of my ancestors. But dreams of Eretz Yisrael seemed most impractical for me during my childhood, for physically ill and frail was I. At 9, a doctor made a thorough exam of my head and predicted I would become a remarkable man. My mother was so happy to hear this. She said, my Dushka, he will become a great rabbi, and he will upset many people. When I was 10, my mother died. Life seemed to have lost meaning. I had a barrenness in my heart. I was obsessed with feelings of human futility. But at 14, I suddenly emerged from this tunnel to throw my heart and soul into the Zionist movement. Arrested twice in his teen years, first simply because his hair was too long and he had the look of an anarchist. The second time, he was mediating a quarrel between 2 rabbis. Arrested by the Russian police, they confiscated his papers and threatened to send him to Siberia. Luckily, he was freed. He made his way to Odessa, where he met with Zionist leaders preparing to make Aliyah. Those Zionist leaders asked him why he decided to immigrate to the Holy Land. They said these words, why would you want to go there and die of malaria? As he wrote, the occasion left me with a lifelong aversion toward people who would talk rather than act. We shipped out soon on a Russian freighter, traveling 4th class, sleeping on the deck covered with filth, knowing, though, that in just 14 days we'd be in Jaffa at the age of 20. He writes, I couldn't find work, but I caught malaria. As the doctor told me I would never shake the disease, the only way to was to leave Palestine. To stay in Palestine meant death. The doctor advised him, go back to Europe. Of course I didn't listen, Ben-Gurion writes. I wrote to my father, there is no going back to the old life. Zionism is a struggle, and one can only feel sorry for those who flee from the battlefield. With my health restored, I joined a group of pioneer laborers in the Lower Galilee and became a plowman, working with 2 oxen. Though the work was hard, he writes, with food and living conditions Spartan, I enjoyed every single minute of it. I began to feel that now I was living the life I'd always dreamt about. I reluctantly agreed to become a journalist. I regretted leaving the land. The fight for everything we wanted was uphill all the way. I worked, though, to unify the Jewish population, to secure Jewish autonomy. I realized that someone with a healthy contempt for words without deeds, someone with a pioneering background like myself, had to represent the true builder of Eretz Yisrael. Ben-Gurion was a student of the Bible, and the prophets spoke most to him. He wrote, quote, "In my youth I studied the Bible and read the poems of Yud Lamed Gordon. When I worked in Sardra, two of my friends, Israel Korngold, watchman of the settlement, and a young farmer, Shimon Melamed, were killed by Arabs during Pesach. Only then did I understand what was in store for us and what was required of this land. I learned two things from the reality of life in the land and from the Bible, which I have read in an altogether different light since I have come to the land. First, that words alone, even the most beautiful words, if not accompanied by appropriate deeds, have no significance at all. And second, that Moses was correct. We are the smallest of nations, and thus we must be a special people. The Jewish people has the needed traits to be a special people, but to achieve this more than any other nation would need a special government that will arouse respect and trust from Jews, as well as the best nations in the world, or else we will not long endure. Soon David Green, as he was known, left the kibbutz to become that journalist, changing his name to Ben-Gurion, after a leader in the Jewish revolt from 2,000 years earlier. And soon, Ben-Gurion formed the Labor Party, beginning his role with the Jewish Agency and then his leadership of the pre-state government. Shimon Peres writes, quote, "David Ben-Gurion was a mythic figure, the founding father of Israel, and a modern-day prophet. A visionary and a pragmatist, he is our Washington, our Jefferson, and even our Lincoln, for the War of Independence brought with it a danger of civil war." Unfortunately, I don't have time in this session to expand much more than past these origin stories, but I want to quickly look at key life moments. I'm going to cue up the slide for us to take a look at. Here you can see both King David and David Ben-Gurion, and their key life moments had significant triumphs and amazing accomplishments, but also failures. Both Davids were flawed leaders, not nearly perfect, but yet they overcame their flaws. They united in their single purpose to lead and govern Israel, to protect its borders and the Jewish people. For King David, perhaps his greatest accomplishment was unifying Jerusalem with Israel. As Nachum Sarna writes, an intrepid warrior, a brilliant strategist, an empire builder, founder of Judah's royal dynasty, a messianic symbol, David is known as the author of Psalms. Both were writers. Since conquering the land of Israel under Joshua, each generation of Israel's leaders unsuccessfully tried to conquer Jerusalem. They could not end the Jebusite tribe's stronghold there. It was King David who united the 12 tribes again, and thinking out of the box, the brilliant military strategist was finally able to conquer Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there as he led the parade himself, transforming the city of Jerusalem into the religious center and capital of the land. Perhaps David's greatest failure was the Bathsheba affair and putting in motion the murder of her husband Uriah. The book of Psalms shares David's ups and downs, the successes and challenges of his life, and that of our own too. There are poems of thanksgiving and celebration, and poems of pain and loss, of deep yearning and searching, as well as gratitude and appreciation. And for our modern-day Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, the greatest achievement was the establishment of the modern state of Israel on May 14, 1948. Proclaiming independence and reading Megillat HaAtzmaut, the Declaration of Independence for the nation and the world to hear. I must pull up the slide from Independence Hall in Tel Aviv. As pictured here, I still get goosebumps when I hear the recording of his voice from that miraculous moment. But there was much more to the story and the circumstances that were extraordinary. Leading up to the day, it was unclear if Israel would declare their independence. Just 3 years after the Shoah and the murder of 6 million Jews, the fledgling state could have been destroyed. Would they declare independence against the advice of General Marshall in the United States? Jewish survival felt in jeopardy. Ben-Gurion felt it dire and necessary to declare the independent Jewish state, but his military leadership and cabinet members wanted a brokered ceasefire, a truce to give Israel more time to prepare for war. It was now up to David Ben-Gurion to do what he did best, to force a discussion toward his preferred decision. He viewed a ceasefire as a trap. Using the sheer power of argument and a vision of victory, he persuaded them to declare statehood with a vote of 6-4. The state was declared. The gates of immigration, which the British had closed, were wide open for Jews to find home. And the war began with Israel's Arab neighbors. And we know the rest of the story. Miraculously, we won as we celebrated Israel's 73rd birthday just a few weeks ago. Ben-Gurion's achievements were towering, the inverse of his physical stature. He became the voice and the face of the Jewish people worldwide. He compromised when needed, such as accepting German reparations money in a highly controversial move called blood money. The most controversial moment of his career was the decision to shell the Altalena munition ship on the shores of Tel Aviv, carrying needed weapons and killing Jewish soldiers on board. Because he believed the democratic government would have been splintered, there would have been civil war, and all would have been lost. He was a pragmatist with unswerving pursuit of his goal, tactically flexible while being strategically consistent, brilliant, flawed, and stubborn. Ben-Gurion ended his political career abruptly with a move to a fledgling kibbutz in southern Israel in the middle of the desert in Sde Boker in the Negev. Here we can see a vision of the fields. He always said, in the land of Israel, anyone who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. Ben-Gurion lived his dream to make the desert bloom. As he wrote, I decided to live in the Negev as a continuation of the ideas that I followed throughout my life, that the principal way that Jews can reclaim their ancient land is not by argument or by invoking historical precedent, but by hard work, creating an enduring, fruitful home for themselves where previously there was nothing. One must show by example, and what an example he was. As we move to wrapping up, our founding father of Israel and David Melech Yisrael Chai Chai V'Kayam, King David and David Ben-Gurion. From David to David, there was none like David. On Shavuot, let us strive to learn and to live from the life lessons of our Davids, and let us all follow the David rules. Chag Sameach, wishing you a very happy holiday.